Hey all, Brian here. So I'm going to read chapter 3 of my book, The Warrior Priest of Dmon-li, book 3 of the Morcyth Saga. If you're if you like it, make sure you follow me, share, like, comment, things like that. You got any questions? Go ahead and ask them. Well, here we go. The dinghy rocked in the waves. All three held on and prayed they wouldn't tip over. A large wave crashed into them, causing the dinghy to pitch precariously. Miko screamed as the edge of the dinghy dipped into the water, but then the wave passed and it once again righted itself. The amount of water in the bottom grew by the minute. "We're not going to last much longer," Jerome hollered over the roar of the storm. "What are we going to do?" Miko cried out. He cupped his hands and tried to bail out the water collecting in the bottom of the boat. "Just shut up for a minute," James hollered back. He gazed at the approaching warship and then to the rising level of water within the dinghy. Glancing over to Jerome, he said, "Don't let me fall out." Realizing what James was about to do, he gave him a nod. Michael watched Captain Carroll and the foam breaker move farther and farther away. Then his attention returned to the dinghy as Jerome moved to sit next to James. His eyes darted toward James and watched as he closed his eyes and became still. James concentrated on the storm above, and a moment later, a large bolt of lightning flashed down from the clouds toward the ship. A gasp escaped Miko as he watched the bolt be deflected away before it could even come close. James' eyes flew open and he cried out, "They have a mage on board!" "Can you deal with him?" Jerome asked as he watched the warship move ever closer. "I'm not sure," he replied. "He feels somehow different than the others." "Different?" asked Jerome. "How so?" "I don't know. It just feels different." "You better do something fast," he said. "That warship is getting close." Another wave crashed over them, and Jerome held tight to James, keeping him from being washed overboard. Closing his eyes again, this time he searched beneath the waves until he found what he was looking for. With a little coaxing, he got it moving toward the surface. Suddenly, one of those whale-like creatures encountered the day before lurched out of the water. As it came back down, it slammed into the side of the warship. Planks were ripped away, creating a large hole just at the waterline. "Yeah!" Michael yelled as the creature sank back into the depths. James felt the prickling of someone else doing magic. He looked to the warship and saw a man in armor standing at the rail with arms raised. Suddenly, the dinghy began to crack as the boards holding it together broke apart. "James!" cried Jerome as the dinghy rapidly filled with water. "Do something!" Thinking fast, he attempted to place a magical seal across the broken boards, but it didn't stop the leak, just slowed it. "The warship!" Michael cried out. Turning to look, James saw it listing slightly off-center. On the deck, the man in armor argued with the sailor as the ship began to turn and head back the way it had come. "They must be sinking!" Michael cried out jubilantly. "Looks like it," agreed Jerome. James watched the men arguing. A decision must have been reached, for the sailor turned away, and the man in armor again stared at them as the warship sailed off. Then the prickling returned as the man in armor raised his hands once more. With a loud crack, the dinghy completely broke in two as if it was pulled apart. Now, the prickling sensation that I talk about throughout my books, that's the feeling people feel when magic's being done. If you do magic, you're more sensitive to it. If you don't do magic, you may feel something, but it may not register on you. But that's what it is. "James!" Michael cried as he fell out of the dinghy into the raging water. Reaching out for him from where he still floated within half the dinghy, James almost got hold of his hand before a wave crashed into them and knocked him backward out of the dinghy's remains. The force of the wave pushed him beneath the water, and by the time he regained the surface, Michael had already been drawn away by the crashing waves. He watched helplessly as Michael was dragged even farther away. He swam toward him, but waves continued pummeling him. Yeah, I like pummeling him. Hang on. Waves continued pummeling him, thrusting him beneath the surface. Each time his head broke free, Michael was farther away. Jerome had managed to somehow cling onto a piece of the dinghy and was desperately trying to stay on it while at the same time moving in his direction. "Miko!" he cried out as another wave once again pushed him beneath the water. When he regained the surface, Michael was nowhere to be seen upon the churning waters. "Miko!" he screamed as loud as he could. Desperately looking around, he feared for his friend. Jerome, still in the remains of the dinghy, had been drawn off as well. James saw him waving at him, and though he hollered, couldn't be heard over the roar of the storm. Doing his best, he tried to remain above the surface as wave after wave crashed into him. Gasping for air as he fought to stay afloat, James was repeatedly pushed under by the incessant force of the waves. In a moment's respite, he looked around and realized Jerome was no longer visible. The warship had disappeared as well. Alone, frightened, he tried to summon the magic to help him stay afloat, but the constant fight simply to remain above the surface made it impossible for him to focus enough for the magic to work. He looked up as another wave rolled toward him. Taking a deep breath, he braced for the impact. The sound of surf crashing on the beach lulled him back to wakefulness. Lifting his head, he realized he had been washed ashore. Soaked and miserable, he came to his feet as the wind whipped rain into him. His arms and legs were weak, and he barely had the strength to move. The effort to stay afloat had sapped all he had. His pack was missing. Must have lost it in the ocean. Moving slowly, he went along the beach away from the water, and then scanned to the left and right. "Miko! Jerome!" he hollered. Even if they replied, it was likely he would hear anything over the sound of wind and surf. He searched the area where he had been deposited. Many waterways drained into the ocean. Stunted trees and grass covered almost every exposed piece of land. It kind of reminded him of a swamp. Not willing to give the others up for lost, he moved deeper inland. After searching the ground for a few minutes, he finally located what he had been looking for. Kneeling next to a small pool of water, he concentrated on Miko, willing the image of him and his surroundings to appear upon the surface. In his exhausted state, he was almost unable to focus enough to call forth the magic. The image wavered and then suddenly came into clarity. He saw Miko lying upon a beach, unconscious, with waves crashing over him. In a panic that he might be washed back out to sea, he quickly formed one of his seeker bubbles and got up to follow it. The bubble moved back toward the beach and then followed the coastline to the left. Moving as quickly as his wobbly legs would carry him, he followed the bubble along the coastline. After several minutes of navigating along the beach, he came to a form lying in the surf. Canceling the spell, he broke into a run and raced to Miko's side. The boy laid face down in the sand and didn't look to be breathing. When he reached his side, he turned him on his back and discovered that he still breathed, but was unconscious. Grabbing him under the arms, he pulled him up the beach away from the pounding surf. Lying him in a relatively safe spot, he knelt next to him as he tried to bring him back to consciousness. Hang on one second. I'll make one quick update. He gently shook him and called his name, but that failed to work. Striking him hard across the face twice caused his eyes to snap open. He coughed and started heaving up seawater. Leaning him on his side, James patted him on the back until the fit was over. James then helped him to sit as he continued coughing until his lungs cleared. Through red eyes, he looked around at the surroundings and between coughs asked, "Where are we?" Shaking his head, James replied, "I don't know. There doesn't seem to be any sign of people." "Jerome? Haven't found him yet. I was too worried about you." "Thanks," he said, just as another coughing fit struck. When it was over, he asked, "Think he made it here like we did?" Shrugging, James answered, "I hope so." Getting up, he looked around until he located another clear pool he could use to find Jerome the way he had found Miko. Kneeling down, he concentrated on Jerome, the magic coming a little easier than it had earlier. Having a brief rest, even so short a one, had made a difference. Miko joined him and sat across the puddle as he watched the water. The image shifted, and then they saw Jerome. He had his knives in hand and was fighting off three others attacking him with spears. James ended the spell of three. Okay, hang on. Three spear wielding attackers. He had his knives in hand and was fighting off three spear-wielding attackers. That sounds better. James ended the spell and stood up abruptly. The seeker bubble formed and began to float away from them, back the way he had come while searching for Miko. He moved to follow it. "Is he close?" Miko asked. "Don't know," James replied as he hurried, almost running as he followed the fast-moving bubble. He began panting as he started using up what reserves of strength he had left. But the area he was in looked to be similar to what is here. The same trees and grass anyway, he explained. If we're lucky, he shouldn't be too far. Running beside James, he said, "Let's hope not." Hang on. I got too many he's in a row. Running next to James, Michael said, "Let's hope not." As they ran along the beach after the bubble, they suddenly heard a crash sounding from farther inland. They came to a halt when a giant lizard-like creature the size of a rhinoceros lurched out onto the beach in front of them. "What is that?" Michael cried out. The creature must have heard him, for it turned its head in their direction and let out a roar. It paused only a moment before charging. An answering roar came from behind them as another of the creatures came out from within the vegetation. James took out one of the slugs from the belt around his waist and propelled it toward the one in front of them with a touch of magic. It struck the creature in the foreleg and lodged itself beneath the skin. Crying out, the creature stumbled slightly and then resumed its course toward them. "You're going to have to do better than that," Michael yelled when he saw how the slug had done little to slow it down. Reaching down, James picked up a stone off the beach the size of a baseball and threw it at the creature, tripling the amount of magic he usually used with a spell. This time, when the stone hit, it struck the creature in the chest and blasted out the back. The creature behind them roared and doubled its speed. James didn't have time to react before it was upon them. They jumped to the side, but the creature grabbed his leg with its mouth, sinking teeth into his calf as it lifted him off the ground. Crying out in pain, James reflexively let loose a blast of magic that burned into the creature's side. Roaring in pain, it let go of his leg. As he fell to the ground, James rolled away from the creature, blood welling quickly from the wound the creature's teeth had inflicted. He came to a stop, then scooted backward along the ground, away from the creature, his leg unable to support him enough to get to his feet. Michael threw sticks and rocks at it to try and divert its attention from James, but the creature ignored him. It looked around and saw James sprawled on the ground. With another roar, it charged forward, slowed only slightly due to the wound in his side. James took out another slug and threw it at the charging creature. In panic, he called forth a tremendous surge of magic, which left him gasping and dazed. The slug struck the creature where its neck left the main body, and the incredible force impact almost removed its head. Attached only by a thin layer of skin and muscle, its head lolled to the side as it fell to the ground, blood spraying upon the sand. Michael rushed around the dead creature to where James lay, with blood pouring out of his leg. "James!" he cried as he came and knelt down next to him. "Michael!" he gasped through the pain throbbing in his leg. "Give me your shirt." Removing his shirt, he handed it to him. James wrapped the shirt around the wound and tied it as tight as he could to stop as much of the blood from escaping. "We can't stay here." Gesturing to the trees, he said, "See if you can find a walking stick, one large enough to support me. We've got to get out of here before the smell of blood draws another of these creatures." Nodding, Michael ran over and returned shortly with a 6-foot-long stick. There you go. Taking it, James held his hand and said, "Help me up." Michael took his arm. Once he was up and stable, Michael let go as he leaned heavily upon the stick. "Are you going to make it?" "I sure plan to," James replied. He took some wobbly steps but found that with the aid of the stick, he could move down the beach as they resumed following the secret bubble. Making their way around the dead rhino lizard, as James called it, they left behind the dead animals. Leaning heavily upon the stick, he and Michael worked their way down the beach. Suddenly, from behind, a cry from another of the rhino lizards came out of the vegetation. It saw the dead one and commenced to tear into the closest. Michael glanced back toward the feasting creature and shuddered. "What are we going to do now? First of all, we need to find Jerome and make sure he's okay." "But you're barely able to walk." James paused as he glanced to Michael. "Be that as it may, I can't let this stop me from helping a friend. I may not be able to walk well, but I am still a force to be reckoned with." Turning away, he continued down the beach. After walking in silence for several minutes, Michael said, "Sorry, I didn't mean it that way." "I know. We just need to find him," James reassured. They continued down the beach for a little bit when they came across 2 sticks stuck in the sand with shells and a skull hanging from a rope tied between them. "What is that?" Michael asked. Coming closer, James could tell that it was placed there by someone. The primitiveness of it made him think of a totem. It was probably put here by locals to warn trespassers to keep out. Maybe we should too? ? "I would if Jerome wasn't up there somewhere," James said, pointing farther up the beach. "He might be okay now," Michael said hopefully. "He is a good fighter." Nodding, James replied, "You may be right. Let's find a pool and I'll try to locate him again. They moved a little inland, away from the pounding surf, but not within the vegetation which may hide a rhino lizard. Looking around, they located a pool that was shielded from the wind whipping in off the water, so remain fairly calm. James settled down around it as Michael sat across from him. Concentrating on Jerome, he watched as the image shifted, and then suddenly they saw him, strapped to a pole as it was carried by two natives. He widened the image, and they saw 6 others carrying spears, traveling with those carrying Jerome. Letting go of the image, he turned to Michael. I don't think he's okay. No, didn't look like it, he replied. How are we to get him free? Won't know that until we get there. Leaning upon his walking stick, he got back to his feet and then returned to the beach. Continuing down the original course, they didn't travel very much farther before they came across a well-trodden path extending up into the swamp area. James paused before it as he contemplated what to do. He glanced at Michael and shrugged before turning to follow the path. Several hundred feet deeper into the swamp, the air turned foul. The stench of decay and gaseous fumes was stifling. What is that? Michael asked, holding his nose. Some areas, like swamps, give off odors due to stagnant water and other rotting decay, replied James. Though I'm no expert on those sorts of things, there's something I read once. The deeper they went into the swamp, the thicker the swarms of mosquitoes became. Michael grew quite slap-happy as he continuously killed bugs that landed on him. For every one he killed, it seemed another dozen or more took his place. The fact that he was bare from the waist up made it even worse. This is unbearable, he complained after killing his 100th mosquito. His back had dozens of raised bumps from where they'd gotten to him. I know, agreed James as he killed another. Let's stop for a second. He tried to remember the shows he'd seen on the Discovery Channel about bugs and attempted to come up with a spell to help keep them at bay. He formulated his thoughts before releasing the magic, and then suddenly a cool mist settled about their exposed skin. It took only a second before the smell hit, the most god-awful smell James had ever come across. Michael gagged and tried to move his head to get away from the odor, but it coated them. What did you do? He gasped, trying to breathe without inhaling the noxious-smelling odor, which was nigh on impossible. Something to keep the bugs off, replied James, eyes beginning to water from the stench. Michael realized that whatever the foul-smelling mist may be doing to his senses, it was in fact keeping the bugs away. No more of those pesky mosquitoes were landing on him, or even coming close for that matter. It worked, James exclaimed in satisfaction. I'd rather have stink than bites, wouldn't you? If it just wasn't so bad, Michael began, but then nodded in agreement. Next time, try to put some perfume in it, okay? The rain had by this time all but slacked off and didn't seem to be washing off the pungent stuff. Okay, agreed James as they once again started following the trail deeper into the swamp. They came across the skeletal remains of one of the rhino lizards they'd run into earlier. It was half sunk in the water, lying next to the trail. The top half of the animal, the part not submerged in the water, still had rotting, decaying flesh attached to the bones. The section within the water looked to have been picked clean. Michael eyed the carcass as they passed and observed small fish swimming in and around the bones. Not paying attention to where he was putting his feet, he accidentally stepped off the trail and into the water. Suddenly, a flurry of activity surrounded his boot as water began to churn. Pulling his boot quickly from the water, he found 3 of the small fishes attached to his boot. Appalled, he rubbed his boot along the ground and quickly scraped them off before running to catch up with James. This time, he paid much closer attention to where he placed his feet. From up ahead, they heard the sound of someone coming down the trail. James moved to leave the path and into the water in order to hide in a copse of trees when Michael grabbed him by the arm and shook his head vehemently. Pointing to the small fish in the water, he warned him quietly, "They'll eat you alive." Nodding, James turned around and quickly led them back down the trail to a group of trees that they had passed just moments earlier. Moving carefully off the trail and making sure not to step into the water, they hid amidst the trees as they waited for whoever approached. A group of 4 warriors appeared out of the swamp as they made their way down the trail. Each carried a lethal-looking spear and wore a necklace of bones. One looked to contain a human ear along with the bones. They held very still as the natives came closer. As they neared the trees where James and Michael hid, one of them paused to sniff the air. The bug repellent, James suddenly realized. He smelled the bug repellent. The warrior cocked his head to the side as if attempting to determine from which direction the smell originated. James watched as the other three took notice as well. After a brief exchange of words, the warriors worked their way closer to the trees wherein they hid. They were almost upon them when a rhino lizard burst from the dense foliage and grabbed one, dragging him off the trail, screaming, back into the swamp. The other three warriors immediately turned and with war cries gave pursuit as they tried to rescue him. "Come on," James said as he came out from behind the trees and hurried down the trail as fast as his injured leg would allow. As they rushed down the path, screams and roars came from where the warriors fought the rhino lizard. "This is crazy," Miko announced after they put some distance between them and the battle. "We don't even know if we're going the right direction." Pointing off to the marshy wetlands, James said, "Would you rather try to cut across country?" Thinking of the little fishes that inhabit the water, he shook his head no. "Then we have to stick to the path as best we can and hope that we run across him," he explained. The pain in James's leg continued to throb with every step. Perspiration coursed down his face. He had to lean heavily upon the stick in order to even remain upright. Out of the swamp ahead came the sound of beating drums. Certain that they had discovered Jerome's location, James hastened along. They came to where the trail diverged, and he hesitated only a moment as he pondered the best way to go. The way leading left went more in the direction of where the sound of the drums originated and looked well traveled, so he turned that way and followed it. From up ahead, the beating of the drums became louder the farther they progressed along the trail. The trees thinned, and they were able to make out a village of crude huts sitting upon an island surrounded by stagnant bodies of water. The trail led straight to it, and they saw where several other trails led away from the island in different directions. "Michael, look!" James whispered as he pointed to a cage sitting on one side of the island. Jerome laid within the cage, shirt soaked with blood and not looking very good. At first, he appeared dead, but then he moved, and James breathed a sigh of relief. Looking over to the island, Michael watched dozens of warriors dance with their spears to the beat of the drums. Surrounding them were the women and children of the tribe, all standing and swaying to the rhythm. In the middle of the dancers stood a man dressed in ceremonial attire, holding a staff atop which sat the skull of some unknown animal. He looked like some sort of witch doctor. "How are we going to get him out of there?" Michael asked, not liking the odds. "I don't know," replied James. "It doesn't look as if they will be doing anything for a while, though." Motioning to Michael, they made their way to the edge of the water where several trees grew that would afford them some concealment while they observed what was going on. Just as they settled into their hiding place, two warriors approached the village from where James and Michael had just come. They were carrying two others who had obviously been chewed upon by a rhino lizard, neither of which looked alive. These must be the ones who almost discovered them earlier. When the warriors reached the island, some of the women wailed as they saw their menfolk being carried in. Several came and took the fallen warriors away into one of the huts. The witch doctor and the warriors dancing seemed not to take any notice of the new arrivals. The dancers suddenly stopped their dance, and the witch doctor began speaking. Gesticulating wildly and speaking loudly, he worked them into a frenzy. James noticed a pile of bones off to the side of the village and pointed it out to Michael. When Michael saw it, he gasped, for mixed in with bones of different types of animals were two human skulls. "Cannibals," James whispered. "What?" Michael asked. Leaning closer so Michael could hear him better, he repeated himself. "Cannibals. They eat people." "Jerome?" he asked, aghast that could be his fate. "Looks like it if we don't get him out of there." Shuddering, Michael looked at the cannibals with unmistakable loathing. While the witch doctor spoke to the assembled villagers, several men erected a large spit. When the spit was fully erected and sufficient wood had been piled beneath it, warriors went to where Jerome was being held and opened the cage door. Two went in and grabbed him, dragging him out of the cage and carried him to the spit. "Can't wait any longer," James said as he watched Jerome being brought closer. He looked to Michael, who nodded understandingly. Michael watched as James settled in and began to work the magic. The witch doctor stood before the spit, staff held at his side. The warriors carrying Jerome approached and came to a stop before him. With one warrior supporting him on either side, they stood in front of the witch doctor. Jerome's head lolled to one side as if he was not exactly conscious. Raising the staff high above his head, the witch doctor began to sway. He chanted as the beat of the drums intensified. Feet stomping, he continued chanting as he danced his way around the warriors holding Jerome. He had gone around them several times when he came to a sudden stop. The chanting ceased as he turned and looked directly over to where James and Michael were hiding. "He knows we're here," Michael suddenly realized. The witch doctor shouted something to the warriors near him and pointed to where they were hiding. He was about to say something else when the villagers as one gasped aloud. He turned to look behind him and saw what looked like creatures made of swamp mud emerge out of the water. Little fishes wriggled within the mud and occasionally fell out to flop upon the ground. Raising his staff, he cried out as a flash of light leapt from the tip of his staff to the nearest mud creature. When the light hit the creature, it lost all cohesion. With a sudden plop, the mud which had formed the creature fell apart and splattered with a sickening sound as it formed a pile upon the ground. The light flashed again and again until all the mud creatures had been reduced to a pile of muck. He turned back towards James and Miko as he pointed his staff. A yellowish beam of light flashed in their direction, but was deflected by an unseen barrier. The villagers cried out as the women and children fled from the island, using paths leading away from Miko and James. The warriors grabbed their spears and raced toward them. "James," Michael said urgently, "they're coming this way." He waited a moment, but James failed to respond. As the warriors came closer, a stick flew up off the ground and twirled above the path, blocking their way. A warrior came close and tried to strike the stick, only to end up being struck himself. The sound of the blow cracked through the swamp, and the struck warrior reeled backwards into his companions. Michael saw James remove one of the slugs from his belt and watched as it flew toward the witch doctor. Inches before it struck, it was deflected away. The warriors holding Jerome returned him to the cage and locked it before joining the others, who tried to get past the whirling stick. Michael saw Jerome begin to regain consciousness and stood up groggily and sat up groggily, holding onto the side of the cage as he surveyed what was going on. The witch doctor again let loose a bolt of energy which was once more deflected before it even got close. A violent tremor suddenly coursed through the ground, and Michael had to grab hold of a tree next to him in order to remain upright. The warriors trying to get past the whirling stick lost their balance and stumbled to the ground. One unlucky fellow stumbled near the water's edge and tripped over an exposed tree root. Crying out, he fell into the water, which roiled with movement as hundreds of tiny fish attacked. Michael watched in horror as the water turned red, and in less than a minute, the water grew calm again, and naught but bones could be seen. The shaking had rocked the island as well, causing the witch doctor to stumble, but had somehow managed to remain standing. James was beginning to pant from the exertion of maintaining the whirling stick and in dealing with the witch doctor. The familiar headache caused by too much magic usage began to make itself known. His vision started to blur as well. He was not going to be able to continue much longer. He needed to finish this quick before he passed out. Michael watched as the island ceased its shaking and the witch doctor stepped closer to the water's edge. Suddenly, the pool of stagnant water near him erupted, throwing muck and water into the air. A good portion of the eruption arced through the air toward the island where the witch doctor stood. Trying to get out of the path of the swamp water, he backpedaled quickly, but not quickly enough. The water fell upon him, and he started to scream as dozens of small fish attached themselves to his exposed flesh, their tiny, sharp teeth digging in hungrily. He tried to tear them off when a hole suddenly appeared in his chest. A spray of gore exploded out his back as one of James's slugs exited his body. The witch doctor fell in a pool of his own blood. The little fishes continued biting and wriggling into his body. The warriors, who'd been trying to get to James, stood in stunned silence upon seeing the witch doctor fall. They cried out in fear as they turned tail and ran, following the paths the women and children had taken earlier. In short order, the island was clear of everyone except Jerome, who remained in the cage and was now more alert. With Michael's help, James got up and made his way along the path to Jerome. When he saw them emerge from the swamp, a big smile broke across his bloodied face. "Thought that might have been your handiwork," he said when they got closer. "Couldn't leave you to be there at dinner, now could I?" James asked as he unlocked the cage. Getting a whiff of the bug repellent, Jerome went, "Gah, what did you two fall into?" "Pretty bad, isn't it?" Michael said. "It may smell bad, but it keeps the bugs off." James did it. "Got any more?" Jerome asked as he killed yet another mosquito who tried to make a meal of him. Nodding, James concentrated and the mist reappeared. Jerome's nose wrinkled as it settled upon him. When James saw his reaction to the smell, he smiled and said, "You get used to it." "I sure hope so." Sorry. One short pause. "We better get out of here before they return with friends," James said. "I doubt if this is the only village in the swamp." He gazed around the island at the many paths leading away. "Which one?" Michael asked when he saw him considering the choices. "We came from the south," he said. Nothing but beach there. The villagers took the paths toward the east, so maybe we should follow the one to the northwest. He pointed to a well-used path that led in that direction. As good as any, Drone said as he went over to the mat on the ground near the cage where his knives had been placed. Strapping them on, he turned to leave and noticed James's leg for the first time. What happened to you? Big lizard came and took a bite out of him, Miko replied for him, but we took care of it, he said as he glanced at James. Didn't we? Giving him a slight smile, James said, we sure did. Hobbling, James continued to use the stick to aid him in walking as he and the others left the island on the northwest path. All right, that's chapter 3. I'll get to chapter 4, I'm hoping tomorrow. So what do you think of my AI-generated thumbnail? Yeah, I did that. When I post these, I get 4, 12. The one I posted 5 days ago has got 17, 18 now views. Maybe this will get more interest. We'll see. Anyway, subscribe, like, you know the drill, and hopefully they'll like it. I'm getting back into this more and more. And if you have any comments about what I'm doing, if you have any suggestions of what I could be doing better, let me know. I'm always open to constructive criticism. Y'all take care and have a good day.